Alright, now I just want to talk about something that I imagine most people went into with a bit of uncertainty. Because it's one of those things where you hear about them making another Christmas Story movie, but it actually stars Peter Billingsley as Ralphie again, just as an adult who has a family and children now, and like most of the original cast is coming back. Like a lot of the original kids who are now adults are in here, and it's one of those things that you hear about it, and you really, really want it to succeed, and you really hope that it does, but you're also really pessimistic because we've seen a lot of stuff like this before, and it typically fails. But this movie is proof that if you have something, that it might actually work out, and that is, believe it or not, caring about the material and still having a heart about the material, and not just doing it to do it. There was clearly a purpose in doing this, and it's, I think, a lot better than most people were expecting. And I saw like the good reviews coming in, and for some reason, even with the good reviews, I was still kind of skeptical in a sense. So I just kind of had to see it for myself to realize why it's so good and why it works so well. And starting off right away, I love that it almost took a second to register that it was Billingsley narrating because he kind of does the Gene Shepard thing so well at this point. It almost seems like he was destined for that. And the fact of making Ralphie a writer, a very struggling writer, who says and does a lot of extremely and painfully relatable things throughout this as the struggling writer. But the fact that obviously Gene Shepard was a writer and his whole book became this whole story to begin with. Just all the choices they made going into this just right from the start seemed to completely make sense. And then one thing in particular that really stands out as far as, yes, this was the best way to approach a story for this kind of movie. Because one thing, first of all, that I had completely forgotten to anticipate was the fact that this is still only set in the 70s because the first movie's in like the late 40s or early 50s or somewhere in that area. Um, so there's still a bit of a period detail to it. So I think that right away is going to there's going to be a little something here that doesn't feel, because one of the things that sucks about a lot of movies like this, where it's like a long delayed sequel, is like the attempts to try to modernize things. I feel like is where a lot of things fall short, and they get too not that that's a bad thing, but they always get too wrapped up in it, and that's where like a lot of the jokes are. So for this to still technically be a period movie, I think was the first thing that was going to really be in its favor. So you're not going to get really any time related jokes, or at least not any that really stand out or aren't too blatant. But what brings them back together, and the idea that obviously when you're bringing the cast back, somebody that you can't bring back, unfortunately, is Darren McGavin, who was Ralphie's dad, and there's also Melinda Dillon, who is still alive, but I believe is retired. So they have Julie Haggerty now. And as far as the whole Julie Haggerty thing, I think she does this well because she has her own kind of iconic grasp on like mom roles. But there are a couple of things here where it's like Melinda Dillon is obvious in A Christmas Story is one of the best mom performers. She's one of like the best movie moms of all time, like easily. And while that's hard to top anyway, there's also the case of the fact that Julia Haggerty kind of has her own way of doing things, so she always kind of feels like Julia Haggerty as opposed to Melinda Dillon. So it's like that's fine in general, but it does kind of make you miss the particular, very specific presence that Melinda Dillon had and the motherly quality that she brought in her own way. But Haggerty still gets plenty of great moments here. One in particular involving her hatred of carolers, and that becoming a whole comedic sequence in itself is really great. But the idea of it starting off with the death of Ralphie's dad, and that being what brings them back together. And first off, they just do this so tastefully to start off with, where he gets the call, but we don't hear the other side of the call. It just cuts to a picture of Darren McGavin on the wall, which I thought was a really beautiful way to do that. And then how that pretty much what this having to do Christmas so soon after his death pretty much ends up being what the plot is, at least the main sort of plot. And it becomes this story of, because it's the whole thing of, it's a family, and particularly a dad, trying to do the best Christmas ever, the most memorable Christmas ever, which is obviously the plot of many Christmas movies, but because of the reason they're doing this, because he's trying to emulate his dad, and because they're trying to work through this grief, it does become a story at the end of the day about, like, grieving through Christmas, because it's one of those cases where obviously it sucks no matter what to lose a family member, especially like an immediate family member or a really, really close family member. But there's always, and this might sound weird to the people who don't take holidays like that seriously. It there's always been this kind of fear in me where it's like something bad is gonna happen around this time of year, because this is like such a happy time of year. And the thing about it is, when tragic events, like tragic personal events, happen in a certain time period, that certain time period is basically forever haunted by that. And the movie actually addresses that right away, where Joel Haggerty like comes out and says, we have to make this the best Christmas ever, so that we don't, to make sure that we don't always associate it with his death, but rather how great he made Christmas when he was still alive, and making that the whole point. Just starting off with that, making that the starting point for whatever else is about to happen here. I honestly can't think of a better way to not only address the fact that Ralphie's dad's not in this movie, but to make a Christmas movie based on that foundation. Even like, take away the fact that it's supposed to be a direct sequel to what's considered one of the greatest, most memorable Christmas movies of all time, but like as a story by itself, like standalone, it really works, and it's something that I feel like we don't see as in depth as we could. But it's a territory that we're all familiar with, or a territory that we hope we're not eventually a part of. And yeah, so just right away, and the fact that whenever, like, first off, when he first walks into the house and we get a little bit of a montage of McGavin from the first movie, and then pretty much whenever he comes up, whenever a memory of him comes up, it always feels like just as much of a tribute to Darren McGavin himself as it does the character, as it does a plot point. And so that's, yes, it's all working out. It's all exactly the way it probably should be. And there's plenty of visual cues throughout it also that are kind of callbacks. And I love that they did it that way. Because there's a lot of callbacks, but they're not as, like, blatant and, like, shameless and, like, really grasping, hoping that you like it as well as the original, like a lot of these movies do. Because the first visual cue that I kind of noticed was a shot of a drawer that's full of, like, junk that looked a lot like the shot of the teacher's drawer when she took away the whole fake teeth prank that they played on her. And lo and behold, during the entire credit roll, there is, like, before and after shots from the original movie and this one that show all the different visual cues. And there's so many that I missed because they were so subtle. And I love that. And I love that that's the time they chose to draw attention to that, was after everything was over. And everything feels much more like a tribute than just, desperately hanging on to what was. They're definitely trying to do their own thing here. There's even a moment where they really play on this, where we get a whole scene seemingly playing out in a way that we already know. When they're driving home and they're singing Jingle Bells, and then the car breaks down, which is like when they have the blowout in the original movie. And we know that the scene in the original movie, this is when Ralphie's going to help him change the tire, and then the Ophage thing happens, and then that whole thing. And so we're kind of anticipating, when they go out to fix the car, that something very similar is going to happen here, but it goes in completely its own direction, and it's completely own thing that has a whole other series of events that goes in a direction we didn't see in the first movie. And I love that they have the setup there, and then just something else entirely, their own different situation, and that ends up becoming like there's a whole plot point in that direction that we go that has nothing to do with anything that happened in the original movie. And that's another way that I feel like you could do this. Like, it makes doing a tribute without being a desperate retread look so easy. It's insane that we have so many desperate retreads that happen. And it's like, no, it can be done. It's right here. Like, everything is laid out. This is how you do a movie like this and a sequel like this. And talking about bringing back the original cast, this that's one of those cases where typically, first off, when they do that, especially if it's, a former child actor who's now an adult that's not really still acting, it's almost like they get afraid, and so they get afraid that they don't have the acting ability now, so it's just like really brief cameos. And no, while, like Flick and Schwartz and all of them aren't in like the whole movie all the way throughout, they're here a lot, and the scenes are fantastic because there's, first off, just right away, when they're first reintroduced, when Ralphie comes into the bar and they're there and Schwartz is playing like a bar game there, he starts narrating, and he has just as much excitement in his voice as Ralphie, in this case, has as much excitement in his voice as the narration that Shepard did in the original movie when they were talking about the mundane things they would do as kids that seemed super, super adventurous. And it's the same thing here. There's even this whole continued rivalry between Schwartz and Flick that apparently has continued since the whole pole incident. And it's like that, like I said, that childlike excitement that you heard in Shepard's voice when he was narrating those moments, Billingsley is able to completely recreate for these scenes where they're adults, but still kind of putting themselves in similar situations. And you really feel like the magic is still there. Like, you get a sense that it wasn't like something left and then came back. You get the sense that it was always there. And that's beautiful. That's just really beautiful. And so any time we had like a Flick scene or a Schwartz scene, or especially them together, was a really magical thing because it felt like nothing had left. There was hardly any time in between. They're just older now, and that's pretty much it. And the way they were able to recapture that is something I never could have foreseen. So, and talking about how much I love the returning characters and how well that went, another thing that helps also is that they do the thing where, like, when they reintroduce Schwartz or they reintroduce Flick, it kind of, like, dissolves into a scene from the original movie to say, like, hey, this is who that person is, and look, it's the same actor and everything. I completely understand why they did that, but I think one of the great things about this also is that even if they didn't blatantly say who the characters were, they still look the same enough that you would have been able to tell anyway who was who. Like, whether it be their appearance or how they interacted with each other, you could have easily been able to tell. But sometimes that goes past people, so I totally get saying, like, blatantly, look, here's the footage to show you this is who this is, and yes, it's still the same person. So I can appreciate that. But something else I really wasn't expecting to like as much as I did was Ralphie's family, because when you go into something like this and you know it's going to be like us revisiting old characters and old faces, it's almost always the new faces that are like bringing it down. Like, it's like there's no effort ever put into the new characters. They're just kind of here to be here, and you're just kind of trying to push them to the side and just focus on what you're here for and what you love already, because no effort is usually put there. But I actually found myself really liking Ralphie's family. Like, his wife is a really good character and has a lot of funny moments, and his kids have a lot of their own moments, especially since they're going through a whole bullying thing like he did also. But once again, it never feels too much like retread. You get the sense of like homage at least, but it never feels like it's being lazy about looking back. which I really appreciate. And like I said, that goes a long way. Like making his family actually watchable and likable in their own right, on top of the returning characters. That was another really big obstacle that usually is a brick wall that writers run into. And so that, like I said, everything is coming together to make this work, and it shows. As far as returning characters, one thing, honestly, if there was really only one thing I think I was really disappointed in, it's a severe lack of Randy. I don't really know what happened there with it being that Randy's like, they've got like a long distance relationship now, and he's barely around, and it's like, I do like that they did call attention to the fact that Randy's the kind of character that buries his head in the sand, and it's like, yeah, looking back on his childhood, you can imagine Randy growing up to be a guy like that. But he only has like two scenes. He has the one scene on the phone, which is a really good scene, and the kind of thing I was hoping to get at the prospect of Randy returning was how they behaved as brothers and how that's developed over the years. And it's a great scene between the two of them, but then we don't see him again until the end. So I feel like we could have used a lot more Randy. I would have loved to have seen a lot more of their interactions. Their like sort of sibling rivalry kind of interactions would have been amazing. And there's another character here that comes in really, really late, but I knew he was going to be here because I saw his name in the opening credits. Obviously, Zach Ward came back as Scott Farkus, and the way he turned out was what they did that was really interesting here was they pretty much do with Scott Farkus what you're probably thinking they will, given how the last time we saw him and Ralphie interacting as children. And yeah, it brings us to that point, but I did actually, it might almost seem kind of obvious and cheap that it kind of starts off as a fake out, and then they pretty much give us what we're pretty much expecting. But but at the same time, it's like, while you might want to criticize it for being what you're expecting, I don't think it really would have worked another way if they took it another direction. I was thinking back to this is a weird example talking about A Christmas Story, but when Trainspotting 2 came out, and Begbie, the Robert Carlyle character, after the first movie had ended and he was like a villain that had been dealt with, and he comes back in Trainspotting 2, and you think that he's going to maybe be reformed in some way because all the other characters are, but he's like worse. He's like much worse, and he's an even bigger villain than he ever was. Part of me thought they could have gone that route, and that would have been interesting, but at the same time, it's like, it's a fun idea on paper, but what could you really do with it? Because tonally, Trainspotting's a whole other kind of monster where they could do that, and it was amazing for that and that character. But here, it would have, like I said, I don't know what they could have done with it if they went that route. So the route that they did go is pretty much the only one that really makes sense. So I can appreciate that in that regard also. And it's a really nice, touching scene also. And speaking of touching, there was one, I've been talking recently about how we've been having a string, we've been very lucky lately that a lot of movies that have come out in the last month or two, a lot of them have had amazing endings. Like, we're seeing a real pattern of movies really finding great endings in this last part of the year here. And this is probably one of the better ones in that lineup, because it's one of those cases where you probably should see where this is going, but it still caught me by surprise in this really emotional way, how it wraps around to the original movie, and how it actually might even make you see the original movie in a completely different light when you go back to it now, in a good way, like in an even more touching way than it already was. And the way, when I realized what they were doing, and it's like just when it kicks in exactly what they're doing here, and then it pretty much cuts immediately to credits, it was like, it kind of blew me away. So, yeah, I am so much happier with this than I ever thought I could be, and that's genuinely surprising. I almost feel like I'm insulting it by saying it's genuinely surprising that it's this good, but I mean, we've just been burned so many times by movies like this and attempted sequels like this. I don't know if anybody saw the quality of this movie coming. And I'm sure it'll be... How good this is might end up getting downplayed because the quality of the original movie is so impossibly high. The people are always gonna like put this asterisk next to it because they'll say like, "Oh, this is really good. It did pretty much everything it needed to. It hit all the right notes." But it's not as good as the first movie. But it's like, I don't really feel like it's necessary to say it's not as good as the first movie because I don't think anybody had that expectation. No, and nobody wants to, like, nobody would want to live up to that standard. The fact that it stands as is by itself as something really good and really accomplished in its own right, I feel like is the main takeaway here. So that's how I see it. So I'm really surprisingly, nearly shockingly pleased with this. So that's how I feel about it. So we're in all kinds of different order here as far as what videos are going out and when, but we're still getting that sorted out, and we will be entirely sorted out eventually. So there's a lot more of all the stuff that you know that's coming. So until whatever the next thing is, I think that's it.